Welcome everyone to the seminar. As I'm scheduled to only talk for about 18 to 20 minutes to leave enough time for comments and discussion, I will first give a short overview of the book and its main objectives, and then, for the purpose of this seminar, go into a bit more detail with only a few of them, concluding with the main takeaways for US-China relations today and in the near future. The main objectives of the book are firstly to bring the historical case of the rise of Japan into the literature on power shifts and the rise of China. Second, to propose a discourse-based conceptualization of identity for the study of foreign economic policy that addresses the dichotomy between ideational and material factors. Third, to address the so-called radical other in post-structuralist IR, but also beyond that in approaches that deal with identity, by highlighting how heterogeneity always disturbs exclusive or binary articulations of identity and difference. And finally, in the book, I propose a method for applying political discourse theory, which is a particular school of discourse theory, via rhetorical analysis. The main empirical material in the book are US congressional debates on economic policy on Japan and China between 1985 and 2008. Although in the presentation and also in the book, in the end, I go beyond both Congress and also the time frame. And the main focus is on the role of national or collective identity construction in those debates. I should also say that the book, or the original manuscript, which was my doctoral dissertation defended in 2015, was not written with Donald Trump in mind, as I frankly was not even aware of him as a figure back then. However, seeing his policies, especially, of course, the escalation of conflict around the trade relationship with China, and especially the surrounding rhetoric, was actually a good reason for me to finally publish this. Because I think it is important to understand that as shocking as many things Trump has done and said are, they are often not really that surprising. In other words, neither he or his policies or even his extreme rhetoric did come totally out of the blue. And I do think that a lot of what is being said about China resonates broadly because there is a longstanding discourse on the main economic competitor as not playing fair. And this started not just with China earlier on, but already with Japan in the 1970s. Now, as much as the rise of China and the assumed global power shift, with all the questions about what this potentially means for the so-called liberal international order, is often described as historical and without precedent, there was actually a surprisingly similar debate not that long ago, when Japan, especially from the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s, due to its exponential economic growth, was proclaimed as the new #1 that might unseat the US from that position, not only with regards to the economy, but also global leadership. So in both cases, if we look at the parallels here, in both cases, the debate was premised on the exponential economic growth of the main trading partner and competitor, as it was actually first Japan in 1982 and then China in 2000 that became the largest deficit trading partner of the United States, and also the largest holder of US debt. That was Japan in 1985 and China in 2008. In both cases, their economic rise was first very welcomed for several reasons, but then especially with the rising deficit and the rising debt, when the economic relationship started to become increasingly problematic, it started to be seen as a challenge to the US, not only economic, but global leadership, and also prompted discussions of US decline, and in that context also of a potential decline or unraveling of the future of the liberal international order. So this means that in both cases, there was a high degree of economic interdependence, but also frictions with the United States in the economic relationship that centered mostly on trade and to some extent monetary policy. This is just to quickly show you what the trade deficit looked like. The blue line is Japan and the red line is China here. I will not stand by and let American businesses fail because of unfair trading practices abroad. I will not stand by and let American workers lose their jobs because other nations do not play by the rules. So this pretty much sounds like what not only President Trump, but also nearly any recent presidential candidate would have said about China almost. However, this was actually Ronald Reagan on Japan in 1985. And this is just one example. There are many more and many harsher things that were said about Japan that I can't go into because of the time now. But what is important to know about these two cases, or about the parallels, is that there was a very similar political discourse about Japan and China being unfair players, of conducting unfair economic policies. So allegedly, they were closing their markets for US companies and products. In turn, they were dumping their products into the US market. In other words, they were cheating by manipulating their currency and so on. And in the end, it was this unfair behavior that got articulated as a reason for their economic success, and also, on the other hand, as a reason for US economic problems, like job losses and a decline in the manufacturing sector, for example. So in both cases, we had a quite heated domestic debate on getting tough towards Japan and China versus getting your own house in order. And although I'm focusing more on the getting tough side here, in the book I show that there was actually a lot of contestation around these issues within Congress, but also beyond. And usually the respective administration would come under pressure from Congress and the media, for example, but this then looked a bit different under the Trump administration. Then there was also a so-called trade war in both cases, as you might be aware. With China, it was launched by the Trump administration. With Japan, it seemed like it was almost constantly on and off, especially in the 80s. Now, it is important to remember that all this is not to say that there aren't absolutely legitimate reasons for addressing problems in the trade relationship, like, for example, with China nowadays, the protection of intellectual property rights. However, some of these problems, especially the trade deficit that Trump has focused on so much, are not quite as uncomplicated as often presented. And the history of trade relations with China and Japan shows that there are a lot of grievances voiced that are not necessarily based on economic facts only, which is why it is important to talk about the role of identity in all of this. So why am I looking at this from an identity perspective? Firstly, because it is largely missing from US-China economic relations from the literature. It looks different when you look at US-Japan economic relations, where it has actually been dealt with in a quite interesting way. Even though when you then look at the public discourse in both cases, there are not only parallels when it comes to the alleged cheating competitor versus the US as fair player and champion of free markets and so on, which obviously constructs the self and other in particular ways. Within that discourse, there's also a quite obvious identity component in that there are frequent expressions of expectations of first economic, then political change or convergence of Japan and China, according to the United States as a role model. And I will come to examples in a moment. As I show in the book, these discourses rest on certain prominent features of US identity, namely American exceptionalism coupled with what I call the liberal theory of history. Now, there's obviously a lot that can be said about exceptionalism on its own, but here I only want to focus on a few features of this sort of combination. It entails the belief in US eternal superiority as great power and universality, or I should say universal desirability probably, of US political values, the necessary interrelatedness of economic and political liberty, which then in turn entails the belief that by engaging your trading partner through liberal trade policy can ultimately also prompt political change in that trading partner. Thus, in this line of thinking, there's a universal path to the liberal capitalist political model, or ultimately the convergence of all difference. Now, there is a strand in the literature on exceptionalism and US foreign relations that basically says it is a US liberal identity in the form of exceptionalism that makes its relations with other countries that are not like the US, for example, not democratic or not capitalist, adversarial per se. Now, without going into all the theoretical details about identity here, what I'm trying to show in the empirical analysis is that even when looking at exceptionalism as an identity discourse, there's no automatism from different to negative other, but it seems that unfulfilled expectations play an important role when it comes to the question whether the relationship between self and other turns antagonistic or not. Now, how does all this look in practice if we start with the Japan case? We should remember that there's a quite a kind of long tradition in US policy to aim to sort of liberate other countries and societies by opening them up to engagement, often via trade with the United States. So as mentioned earlier on, Japan's rise was actually first very welcomed in the US, as it was the US occupation and political re-education of Japan after the Second World War, coupled with Japan's economic growth, that was actually welcomed as a validation of the US economic model. In other words, it seemed like Japan was on a trajectory to actually become more like the United States. However, as I also mentioned, the growing trade deficit, the growing debt, led to problems in the economic relationship, and the question emerged how Japan, as supposedly junior partner, could actually outperform the US economically. Was it because Japan was not playing fair? And if that was the case, then the US might end up as a victim of unfair Japanese policies. And Japan's success, and especially Japan being a creditor to the US, obviously ran counter to American exceptionalism. And in that context, then the question was asked, or the allegation was made, that Japan was actually more different from the US and the OECD West than previously assumed. In a nutshell, Japan's economic policies were linked to its different societal and cultural characteristics. So it was claimed that they were, for example, collectivist, inward-looking, not about competition, but about managed trade, thus not liberal. But also on a personal level, they were described as selfish, greedy, treacherous, and so on, which in the end meant that an understanding based on the assumptions that free trade policies would work with Japan as with any other Western trading partner was criticized. As it was expressed by IPE scholar Robert Gilpin at that time in the late 1980s, Western liberal societies find Japanese economic success particularly threatening because it was the first non-Western and non-liberal society to outcompete them. And that threat was then supposed to be dealt with a more hardline approach in trade negotiations, which was advocated by the so-called revisionists, who managed to convince the late Clinton administration of their understanding of Japan and its economy as different, closed, and threatening. But ultimately then this new hardline approach did actually not lead to a more balanced trade relationship. However, it caused a more severe crisis in their relationship since the Second World War. The Japan problem then basically vanished by itself with the economic crisis in Japan and in Asia in the mid-1990s, but also with the attention in Washington shifting to rising China. Now, if we move on to the China case, here we see that the belief in the transformative impact of engagement through free trade, not only on the economic but also political system, has been quite visible in economic policy on China from the beginning on. As with Japan, China's rise since the 1980s was first welcomed as long as it was happening to US expectations, again with the idea that China will become more like us, so to speak. So, for example, when China's quite contested entry into the WTO was debated, this was expressed as follows: trade in general can open up the Chinese economy and ultimately its politics too. This requires faith in the power of markets and economic freedom to drive political change, but it is a faith confirmed by experiences around the globe. Then again, as with Japan, with the growing trade deficit and the rising debt, the question arose whether China was actually outperforming the US economically and how this could be possible. Was it because China was not playing fair? And again, the US was ending up as a victim of unfair economic policies by its major trading partner instead of being a role model and guide, as it was previously assumed. Obviously, we have to remember that with China, the starting point in the relationship was very different from that with Japan. Not only that China wasn't a US ally, but in that communist China was always sort of more backwards from a US perspective than Japan when we think about trajectories of converging. As IR scholar Aaron Friedberg expressed it, and in my view nicely captured this kind of issue of failed expectations, in 2011, he wrote that for Americans, the success of a mainland regime that blends authoritarian rule with market-driven economics is a puzzle and an affront. Such a combination is not supposed to be possible, at least in the long run, as this obviously also runs counter to American exceptionalism. Now, fast forward in 2018, this kind of similar idea or this line of thinking was expressed by Vice President Mike Pence as follows: after the fall of the Soviet Union, we assumed that a free China was inevitable. Giddy with optimism at the turn of the 21st century, America agreed to give Beijing open access to our economy, and we brought China into the World Trade Organization. Previous administrations made this choice in the hope that freedom in China would expand in all of its forms, not just economically, but politically, with a newfound respect for classical liberal principles and so on. But that hope has gone unfulfilled. Now this, interestingly, is not just a narrative of the Trump administration, but what many now call the China reckoning seems to be widely shared, or is widely shared across political divides in the US Congress and beyond, especially when it comes to US economic grievances. So a line of publications and commentaries seems to conclude that we have to realize that things did not evolve as expected, that China did not evolve or behave as anticipated, and most importantly, that China did not become more like us. However, even if there seems to be a consensus on this, it is not entirely clear what the consequences are. So under the Trump administration, it looks like, okay, there will be a more hardline approach, but we don't know yet what this will mean under a Biden administration, for example. There's also a consensus on that China under President Xi Jinping has taken an authoritarian and assertive turn, both domestically and internationally, but it is again not entirely clear how the US is going to deal with it. As Zakaria put it in 2019, the essential strategic question for Americans today is, do these facts make China a vital threat? And to the extent that they do, how should that threat be addressed? And the bigger question, in my view, still seems to be how do we deal with, or how do we actually handle challenges to ingrained expectations or ways of thinking? This is also something we can ask ourselves in academia, obviously. As it seems that all too often this challenge is still met with what IR scholar David Campbell has called a central feature of states and their foreign policies, namely the externalization of an internal problematic and its attribution to an external cause or enemy in order to account for inner deficiencies, which then usually leads to a discourse on the threatening or adversarial other. And obviously for personal political gains, it is easier to blame someone else than to address your own deficiencies. However, and this is why I think it's important to talk about the role of identity in all of this. It would be too easy to do away with all of this just as political maneuvering or political rhetoric. But instead, the impact of an equally persisting discourse of uniqueness and national greatness, thus being superior per definition, and the idea that one should function as a role model for everyone else has to be taken seriously, and that it makes it quite difficult to accept that one might not always be right. And this does obviously not only apply to the United States. Now, one could ask if there is light insight in terms of a more humble approach in foreign relations. And interestingly, two former Obama administration officials in 2018 published a piece, I think it was in Foreign Policy or Foreign Affairs, where they write that a starting point for a better approach towards China is a new degree of humility about the United States' ability to change China that seeks neither to isolate nor to weaken or to transform it. So obviously in their view, this wouldn't mean that the United States shouldn't confront China on certain issues, but the kind of basis for doing this would look a little bit different. And whether this is a realistic approach or not, obviously that is something we could discuss, and we could also discuss what this would mean for US-China relations under President Biden, who of course was part of the Obama administration, but will now probably come in with a different agenda. Now to quickly wrap up the main conclusions of the book more generally, I tried to show that the so-called new era in US-Chinese relations was actually quite long in the making, and it rests partly on long-standing discourses on the main economic competitor as an unfair player. Secondly, that economic questions cannot or maybe should not be understood as rational assessments of resources and capabilities alone, as they are not exempt from questions of identity. In this view, the rises of Japan and China posed a challenge to American identity or American exceptionalism and the liberal theory of history, as they were countering expectations of convergence. And it seems that failed expectations play a huge role when it comes to the Trump administration's openly more hardline approach towards China. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicola, for a great talk. And let's move on to Iain right away.
Well, great. Thanks very much, Björn, and thanks very much, Nicola, for inviting me to participate in this discussion. I just want to preface my comments by saying this is really great work, Nicola. It's really innovative theoretically. It's important insights into the similarities, the continuities between the Japan case, the American reaction to the Japan case, and the China case. Some have speculated over the years about potential similarities, but haven't done the hard work and the creative empirical work as well to really nail these similarities using this identity discourse method. So that's all great. And I agree with much of your analysis about how US exceptionalist discourses about US virtue, about law abiding, et cetera, frames perceptions of the other as a cheater, as being unfair, as violating rules. It's not a coincidence that the term rules-based order is almost exclusively used to describe China's foreign policy and not, for example, Russian or the foreign policies of other countries. It's almost used exclusively to describe China's violations of the so-called rules-based order. So that's all great. I just wanted to, I have two basic comments. One is a slight disagreement with, or a different reading of the affront argument that Friedberg, that you use Friedberg for, and then a suggestion for further research. That'd be my second point. So the first point, it's based on my reading, at least, of public statements by the executive branch, by President Clinton, Bush, by their secretaries of state, their national security advisors, et cetera. And with conversations with a number of people who held important executive positions or positions in the executive branch handling China policy, I have a somewhat different reading of the sort of non-convergence or affront discourse, namely that China's development path was an affront to US liberal identity that links markets to political liberalization, because I have a somewhat different reading about the failure of engagement. So I'm not sure that affront is the central element, at least, of the effect of China's identity challenge. Now, there are China hawks, and I would say the peace through strength types, the religious conservatives, American nationalists, have always believed that China would not liberalize as long as it was run by the Communist Party or by an atheist Communist Party. And this even was the case even before 1989, before the Tiananmen massacre, but especially after that. They didn't expect convergence, so they weren't particularly affronted by the absence of convergence. Rather, the China hawks of various types used a caricature of engagement to critique engagement, and particularly in the last few years. But the engagers in the executive branch didn't really expect political convergence in the form of democratization or of the PRC. Theirs was a more subtle argument, in my view. Now, to be sure, the Clinton administration, for example, sold engagement for China's entry, paving the way for China's entry in the WTO, as claiming it would lead to political liberalization. But more often, he and his cabinet and his national security advisors hedged on that possibility. While I think their argument was that while societal liberalization would result in the demand from ordinary citizens for economic freedom, for more lifestyle choices, for government accountability and responsiveness, political liberalism or liberalization, in other words, substantial improvements in freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of association, let alone full democratization, was not considered inevitable. Given the power and interests of the Communist Party, and would in any event require a lot of external pressure. They did believe that you might get limited improvement in human rights performance, and that was generally the most the executive branch could hope for. Just to give you a classic example of this kind of lowered expectations, Albright, the Secretary of State, said in 1997, "It is our hope that the trend towards greater economic and social integration of China will have a liberalizing effect on political and human rights practices. Given the nature of the Chinese government, that progress will be gradual at best and is by no means inevitable." And Clinton himself said in his 2000 State of the Union address that, yes, he hoped that China would head in a liberalizing direction, but he said, quote, "No, we don't know where it's going." So there are lots of other kinds of quotes like that from senior US officials suggesting that the last step, economic liberalization to societal liberalization, the last step to political liberalization might not happen, was going to take a long time, and was up against the Communist Party's resistance. More importantly, the policy experts in the State Department and the National Security Council, the people who are on a daily basis handling China policy through the first Bush administration, the Clinton administration, the second Bush administration, and into the Obama administration, they had no policy guideline or no policy guidance to pursue political liberalization. There was no kind of roadmap for encouraging political change in the PRC. Engagement was mainly aimed at opening Chinese markets to US businesses, pulling China into arms control institutions, for example, or into economic institutions like the World Bank. It was used for piecemeal management of the relationship, for shaping internal economic and Chinese external behavior. I don't think there was much magical thinking among those in the executive branch handling policy about an expectation about convergence in political democratization terms. Now, in the press, amongst the pundit world and in Congress, and when Clinton was trying to sell the WTO, there was a lot of, I think, quite lazy and wishful thinking about political liberalization. But I don't think in the executive branch there was really any realistic expectation of those who were making economic and political security policy towards China, that there was any expectation that there would be genuine political liberalization. So interestingly enough, Chinese concerns about peaceful evolution or challenging the legitimacy of the Communist Party exaggerates the threat, I think, on the Chinese side for obvious reasons. The critics of engagement, however, especially in the Trump era, took a caricature of engagement and used it as a political tool to delegitimize engagement, which I think was necessary for limited decoupling and for countering China in the political and military realm. So I think there was a strategy, or there is a politics here behind the failure of engagement argument. Now, this is not to say that the kind of the engagers, the handling policy inside the executive branch did not accept a notion of US exceptionalism based on the notion of US virtue or rule of law, but it's a matter of degree. They just don't hold, I think, as strongly as the critics of engagement do. US conservatives are what I would call exceptionalist or exceptionalism purists, more so than the engagers running a policy in the Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama administrations. The sort of the practice engagers or the weak engager, the practice engagers or the practice exceptionalists or the weak exceptionalists, remember, included centrist Republicans and centrist Democrats. So I don't think that they were as affronted by China's lack of political liberalization as the critics of engagement claim. So that's my sort of different reading of the argument that Americans were affronted by the lack of political democratization or political liberalization in China. In terms of next steps, the second point, this is a suggestion for further research building on the excellent base that you've already established with the focus on the challenge to American exceptionalism in terms of the rule of law, notions of American virtuousness. And that is, it may be that there are multiple identities at play in the US-China and US-Japan relationship. There is the exceptionalism that you identify, and I think is absolutely accurate, namely the notion of US virtuousness, the importance of the US as being this exemplar of upholding the rule of law, and therefore Japan cheating, China cheating, violating the rules of the game. There's a lot of sports metaphors. But there's also another identity, and that's race. And racial identification, I think, as you know, is understudied in mainstream international relations. But we also know, particularly as we've observed in the last 4 years, how central racial identification, particularly white racial identification, is in American politics, given the tens of millions of white Americans who were influenced by racial resentment to vote for Trump, both in 2016 and particularly in 2020. It would be surprising if racial identification didn't play a role in US-China identity discourses. But as I say, it really hasn't been studied much. So in addition to the discourse about cheating, the US upholding notions of fairness, the Chinese or Japanese violating these notions of fairness, I think we should be alert to sort of ethno-racialist stereotyping on both sides. So, for example, in the United States, there's lots of anecdotal evidence that that there are elements, at least, of racial stereotyping in the discourse about China. The Committee of 100, which is a Chinese-American lobbying group, has had polls over the years that show about 35% of Americans believe that Chinese Americans, so American citizens, but who are ethnically Chinese, are more loyal to the PRC than they are to the United States. That's a very large pool of people to draw on if you wanted to make a political argument that that ethnic Chinese are a threat to American society. Politicians use these stereotypes frequently. Let me just share screen to give you an example of some of those stereotypes. Can you see this? So this is an ad that the Tea Party candidate in the Republican primary in 2012, Ron Paul, used against the Republican John Huntsman, who had been ambassador to China. He basically morphs John Huntsman into an image of a Chinese person, and the question in the ad was, what are his real values? Who is he really one of us? The next ad is an ad that appeared from a small government tax-cutting lobbying group called the Citizens Against Government Waste. This is a screenshot of a video that they produced of a set in the future where a Chinese professor is lecturing to Chinese students about how the United States now works for us because the US had gotten into so much debt towards the PRC. A very sinister kind of imagery. This was in a campaign in the senatorial race in 2012, where Pete Hoekstra, who is currently the US ambassador to the Netherlands, was running against a Democrat in Michigan and used a stereotype of a Chinese peasant in the countryside speaking broken English to criticize his opponent in the campaign for spending too much money and benefiting the PRC. This one is the most recent, which I find an astonishing imagery that appeared on the State Department webpage. This is actually appeared in the tweet from outgoing Secretary of State Pompeo. An image of a cunning, threatening symbol of China and the Chinese, the symbol that Chinese people themselves endorse as a sort of the metaphor for China, threatening innocent American students on US campuses. This is part of the discourse of the alleged Chinese subversion of American youth. More recently, when COVID broke out, you had a Texas Senator, John Cornyn from Texas, saying China is to blame because the culture where people eat bats and snakes and dogs and things like that. The former policy planning, head of policy planning, Skinner suggested that China's rise as the first non-Caucasian challenge to American dominance created a clash of civilizations. One assumes because China being non-Caucasian, therefore China didn't accept rules that presumably Caucasian countries like the United States had set up. You have President Trump referring to the Kung flu. You have analysts in the US government and outside the US government who continuously refer to Chinese cunning, being exceptionally good at deception, the Chinese thinking in long-term strategy terms only. No particular reason as to why that might be the case. These are all examples. Now, they're anecdotal, of course. We don't know how systematically they are distributed or used inside the policy process. But these are what Marika Landau-Wells, a scholar at Berkeley, calls threats of contamination, cultural, ethnic, and ideological contamination, which are distinct from threats of material loss or material harm. So I think the exceptionalist purists, the people who kind of have engaged with these kinds of stereotypes, ethnic, racial stereotypes, they tend to be in the right wing. They tend to be motivated by an extreme version of Christianity, by a vague notion of anti-socialism, as well as racial stereotyping. But they were never proponents of engagement. Therefore, they were not disappointed or haven't been disappointed by engagement or affronted by the Chinese challenge to liberal theory of development. So if racialized, and I'm just finishing up now, Björn, if racialized identity arguments become more prominent in US assessments of the China threat, we should expect similar developments on the Chinese side in the PRC as Chinese ethnic exceptionalism becomes more prominent and interactive with US racial identity arguments. It's not a big step to go from the Chinese Communist Party's expectations that ethnic Chinese, due to their ethnicity, should be loyal to the PRC's rejuvenation, regardless of their nationality, regardless of their citizenship. It's not a big step from that to a racialized claim about opponents to Chinese rejuvenation. It's also not a big step from the Chinese Communist Party's expectations that ethnic Chinese, due to their ethnicity, should be loyal to the PRC's notion of rejuvenation. It's not a big step from there to complaints by American white identitarians about the loyalty of ethnic Chinese in the United States. And so here, the blurring of the CCP's blurring of ethnicity and loyalty interacts with the US racialist blurring of ethnicity and loyalty. And so, essentially the CCP's blurring of ethnicity and nationality feeds racism in the United States and vice versa. Now, I'm not suggesting that all critics of the CCP use racialist stereotypes. Clearly, liberal critics of the treatment of the Uyghurs, of the Tibetans, of political dissidents certainly don't use racial stereotyping. But there may be a sufficient number of people with racialized perceptions of China in the population or in the political classes, particularly if a Trumpist wins in 2024. Enough of that in the population or the political classes to matter in foreign policy. I would also watch for the emergence of a new identity discourse or a revised identity discourse where the US is a victim. We emphasize the role of victimization in Chinese identity discourses about the century of humiliation, et cetera. You tend not to see victimization discourses in the United States about identity. But you do see victimization discourses in the white identitarians who've identified with Trump. And so the US is a victim both of the PRC subversion, so efforts to bribe Biden's family, to control Biden, to subversion in the American education system, to literal contamination, namely through the spread of COVID. So this notion of ideological and literal contamination is part of the discourse, I think, about CCP influence that's being pushed in the far right in the United States, so the Trumpist part of the political spectrum, by major influencers, Bannon, Pompeo, and we should expect amongst the likely candidates on the Republican side for 2024, Hawley, Cruz, Rubio, Cotton, to perhaps push a victimization identity as well, this would be a natural extension of the Trumpists' white identity victimization at the hands of an internal enemy, the left, or the Democratic Party, connecting to victimization at the hands of an external threat, namely the Chinese Communist Party and its ideological and literal contamination. All of this underscores, I think, a major additional research step, namely testing hypotheses about race and national stereotyping of self and other, along with other ideological and cultural exceptionalist stereotypes, Americans as rule makers and rule preservers, or Chinese as inherently peaceful, both of which are empirically, of course, problematic. Of course, the test of whether racial stereotyping influences policy requires a third case, it seems to me, where the rising economic power is not identified as racially different. And this would be obviously best methodologically, and perhaps the next step, for example, would be to study US identity discourse about Europe's rise as an economic power. To the extent that is not prominent, in other words, identity arguments are not prominent in that discourse, or to the extent that the threat of non-American capitalism or the threat of managed globalization coming from Europe is not considered a threat, or not an obvious threat. The obvious question then is whether this is because of perceived shared transatlantic ethnocultural identity. So I'll stop there. Sorry for going on and on.
Oh, no worries. It was very interesting. So thanks a lot, Iain, for those thought-provoking and very useful comments. So before we move into the Q&A, I will let Nicola respond for a couple of minutes, and I remind everyone, please use the Q&A function in Zoom to write your comments. Please, Nicola.
Hey, thank you so much, Iain. Obviously, there would be a lot to discuss about both of your points. Super interesting. The issue, if I start with the question of race, I have thought about that's actually missing in the analysis, that it would be really interesting to look into that, especially because I think that if you look beyond political science, so in the humanities, especially history, there are studies done of the influence of the yellow peril thinking, and I have actually a colleague at Turku University who's looking into this also, both in the Japan and China case, and also of what you said about whether then there will be kind of racial stereotyping on both ends, like in the US and in China. As you in the Japanese case, you saw this uniqueness argument, right? It was there on both sides, so that would be interesting to look into. And also because you already see the victimization discourse to some extent on the economic front, so to what extent that would then be extended and so on. So really interesting. I hope I will have time to look into this in the future. Also briefly on the first point you made, I think again it would be really interesting to have a longer discussion on this, but just a few quick thoughts. I think it was really beneficial that you highlighted that it looked differently in the kind of administration, because I have mostly been looking at Congress, and my impression was that there is a kind of more maybe more hawkish understanding of the kind of liberalization prospects. But then I was also wondering two things, basically, whether the administration meant this or not, like repeating these kinds of things, you know, if we speak of discourses having kind of their own life or like unintended consequences, I wonder whether like what the consequences of this have been, or for this kind of thinking with the broader public. Also because in my impression, I'm not so sure whether it's only those who have been critics of the kind of liberal thinking for a long time use a caricature of it, or whether you don't also see some self-proclaimed liberals who kind of seem really offended by, I mean, maybe I exaggerate a bit, but seem somehow personally almost offended by, oh, it didn't turn out as we thought. Maybe not so much in writing, although I think there have been some publications where I also thought that, but especially in like on conferences and these kinds of appearances. I'm thinking a little bit about the Stockholm China Forum here too. So yeah, I think that would be interesting to discuss this a bit further. But yeah, I will stop here so that we have time for Q&A too.
Right, thank you. So we have a couple of questions so far. So I start with 2 questions, although I think they hang together, from Jonathan Lundin. And I guess these are for you, Nicola, but of course, Iain, you please feel free to respond if you feel you have anything to say. So Jonathan asked whether these US fears toward Japan before and China now should we understand them as overblown, or can we see them as rational? Your opinion on that, and also sort of the differences between these US fears toward China and Japan. Is there a substantial difference there that China is becoming more successful than Japan was or is in overtaking the US economically and politically?
Should I reply right away?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Thank you. Great questions. Maybe quickly first on the differences. I didn't get to speak so much about that, but I do say a few more things about how these cases differ in the book. So obviously, interestingly, I mean, Japan was a US ally, right? So and also because of the constraints on Japan's security policy and so on, they were, I mean, not supposed to, or it wasn't possible for them to realistically become a military challenge. Like China can. So that is one of the differences that it is usually pointed to. However, there was a discourse or a debate on, Japan also becoming a military threat for the US, which is somewhat even more surprising looking back at that now. And it is also interesting because in IR we have all these theories, who say that it starts with the economy, and then that will lead to a clash between rising powers and so on. So one could ask ourselves what impact that has had on the debate with Japan, for example. The other question of whether US fears are overblown. I mean, what I think is important to keep in mind here is that that's what I tried to point out in the end. I mean, it depends a little bit on whom, first of all, whom you ask. Like maybe I don't want to give the impression that I'm saying like, oh, this is all kind of, either just political rhetoric or they are just going crazy. That is not the point here. But why I'm looking at this from an identity perspective is that, in my impression, if there's a persistent discourse of American exceptionalism, for example, that basically says, this is the greatest nation, it can't fail, and so on, it has an impact on people's thinking, on like everyday people's thinking, not just politicians. And if these kinds of things are said, whether they are meant seriously or not, some people will take it seriously. And so I don't think that we can simply say, oh, this is overblown, but it has to be taken seriously by looking at where this kind of perception actually comes from, beyond just looking at, China's material assets are growing or their military is growing and so on. Yeah. I don't know if Iain wants to add something on this.
Right. So let's move on to the next one. So I think first I have one more for you, Nicola, and then one for Iain as well. So this is a question about identity from Simone Dossi. So Nicola, considering that you analyzed a rather long period of time, did you find any sign of changes or an evolution of some sorts in US identities related to international politics in general during this time period? And then it's sort of a broad question to you, Iain, but I know you've been following this topic for many years about China-US relations, basically. Do you see any trends that could be expected to be strengthened in this post-corona, even though we're still living through it, but this in the post-corona world? And I think this is especially relevant now, of course, since we are expecting the new Biden administration very soon. But if you would like to start, Nicola, with a question about identity.
Yes, thank you also for that question. Yes, I mean, I would say you do see change, but it depends a little bit on where or who you look at or where you look at, because obviously what I focused on in this presentation are kind of broad lines of recurring things, and these things do recur, but it doesn't mean that they are uncontested. I guess you don't see, I wouldn't say that you see like a linear change, but you see kind of a back and forth in, okay, who more or less dominates the debate here. No change from a kind of more inclusive or a more exclusive trajectory. It depends on a little bit where you look at. Sorry, a little bit fuzzy answer, but yeah.
Thanks. And then a question for Iain. I should say as well, I forgot that it's Peter Danielsson that posed a question.
Well, actually, if I could defer to Nick, I don't want to put Nicola on the spot, but this is her book, her presentation.
No
so
worries.
Perhaps you should go first, Nicola.
Oh, but I thought this was a question for you, wasn't it?
It wasn't for anyone in particular. So,
sorry, what was the question?
Do you expect any trends in China-US relations, after the Corona pandemic?
Under the Biden administration?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So maybe briefly, what my impression is so far, I mean, most people are saying that the tone will definitely change, which is maybe not that surprising, but that actually the content is not going to change that much, especially when it comes to trade. Because here there is a consensus that something has to be done about the problems in the relationship, but the methods that the Trump administration was using weren't really that consensual. Yeah, I think it is going to be interesting to see if there is still, because Biden has also said that he will want to cooperate with China on global issues such as the virus, for example. So I think here we will definitely see some change, but it will depend a little bit on which area we are looking at. But I would also like to hear what Iain has to say on this.
Yeah, I know. I don't disagree. I think if you look at the personnel appointments, these are people who have had a lot of experience dealing with Asia, dealing with China. They're pragmatic centrists for the most part. I think this will mean that there will be less emphasis, not a complete de-emphasis, but less emphasis on ideological competition. There are a couple of people who are likely to be in the administration who believe in that there is an ideological competition. I think the senior director of the China NSC believes that, but not to the degree or intensity, I think, of the previous administration of Pompeo and Pottinger. There will be efforts, obviously, to look for areas of cooperation on climate change, on public health, two issues that the Trump administration either ignored or rejected as being important. I think there'll probably be the U.S. military will be given more leeway to look for crisis management dialogues and mechanisms with the Chinese military, partly out of a realistic expectation that there will be more crises. But it's a problem-solving administration. They will continue, I'm sure, to make sure there are restrictions on sensitive technology transfers to the PRC. They'll continue to take a fairly high-profile position on forced cultural assimilation of Uyghurs. The big question mark, I think, for the Biden administration, it will be whether to declare China's policies towards the Uyghurs as meeting the criteria for genocide. And if they do make that decision, then that introduces a much more volatile element into the US-China relationship, and also into a huge public relations problem for the PRC as well. But putting that aside, I agree that you're likely to see a higher level of efforts to find areas of cooperation, less of an ideologically driven public policy towards the PRC. And the one added thing, I think you'll see more high-profile presence in Asia. Kurt Campbell and other high-level officials will probably spend more time in Asia than any of the Trump administration officials did, just to demonstrate U.S. presence.
So we actually want to go through all the questions. Time to go through all the questions. There's a number of great questions here, but I think we only have time for one last one, and that is from Young. So Young asks, assuming that fear is easy to fan up but not easy to calm down, how did the fear of Japan subside then in the United States? And also related to this, would such a development be possible with the China fears that we've been seeing in the US recently? I guess that's for you, Nicola.
Yes, thank you. That is a great question. I think I was asked before at some point, or someone made the comment that, oh well, the US learned to live with Japan's rise or with the Japan problem. But actually they did not, because the problem kind of fanned out with the Japanese or Asian economic crisis in the mid-90s. So the trade deficits and all that kind of disappeared. But then it shifted to China gradually. So the question is, what would have to happen in US-China relations for it to subside? And I mean, no one obviously can seriously hope for a crash of the Chinese economy or so that for that to happen. So I think this is something that has to be solved politically. There is no automatic solution for that here, and it seems that we will deal with this for quite a while. And it's not only about the United States; it's about Europe too. The discussion about a Chinese high-tech threat and so on. So I think there will be a lot of discussion to be had about that in the future.
Yeah, if I could just quickly add a couple of points. I agree with Nicola on that. A couple of other big differences. Japan was not very proactive in international institutions. It was, as they say, punching below its weight in international politics more generally, not in international economy, but in international politics. So with the rise of the concern about China's power, from everything from Tiananmen massacre in '89 through the first the Taiwan crisis in '96, through to the response to the U.S. bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, the EP3 incident in 2001, etc. That, in a sense, created an alternative notion of where threats come from. Japan was not engaged in any of that kind of behavior, right? By the time the Japanese recession hit, as I say, Japan was just not involved in international politics to the degree that the PRC was becoming increasingly. The other is that, Japan, despite the fact the Liberal Democratic Party dominated politics, is still a liberal democracy, and the PRC is not. And so that clearly is not going to change. The third issue, at least in the foreseeable future, the third issue is, I think the big difference is that there was not a large Japanese American population that the Japanese government, for example, was trying to mobilize for its own purposes. And I think the damage that Xi Jinping or the Chinese Communist Party's the damage that's been created for local Chinese populations, whether it's in Australia, Canada, or the United States, because the PRC does not differentiate between ethnicity and nationality, is going to have a lasting and negative effect, unfortunately, partly because of the racial identifications inside the United States, Australia, Canada, et cetera, is unfortunately going to make it continue to make it difficult to, for particularly on the far right, for the image of China as a threat to dissipate. So I think in that regard, the Chinese Communist Party's blurring of ethnicity and nationality, refusing to acknowledge in a sense, the independence of ethnic Chinese populations around the world, is actually, just adds to the problem of the perception of the China threat, and it seems to be counterproductive.
Iain, Nicola, thank you so much for joining us today. To me, it's been absolutely fascinating, a lot of great insights. I remind everyone to check out Nicola's book, out recently, From Japan Problem to China Threat, Rising Powers in US Economic Discourse. And to everyone around the world who has joined us for this Zoom seminar, thank you very much. Hope to see you soon again to take part in EU activities, whether from the Asia program or our new China Center. Good evening.